Okay, you guys all have big plans for the weekend? Not really. I mean, once again, the COVID world, right? If you did have big plans, you're probably going to get in trouble. So, yeah. No, I don't think I've got anything particularly exciting either. I guess you have homework number 3 to work on. That's pretty exciting. Not really. Anybody take a look at that last night? Probably not. All right, well, if you do get to it this weekend and you have some questions, you can always send me email, all right? But we'll definitely have some time on Monday and Tuesday. You notice that it's not due till Tuesday at midnight. I must have been feeling particularly generous when I said that. But you'll have some time Tuesday, right? And so we probably won't have class either Monday afternoon or Tuesday afternoon. I have to figure out which one works better. But anyway, so you'll have a little bit of time next week. And we're not having class this afternoon, right? Yay. So anyway, hopefully we're feeling very close to the weekend where we can get a little rejuvenated, get caught up on things. And then remember, your second exam is on Wednesday, right? So this would be a really good time to begin, if you got a little downtime, to get prepared for that. So, okay, so today we're going to talk about central banking. So if you remember in this class, we really have 3 big topics. We have financial markets, meaning bond and stock markets. We have banks, and then we have central banking. Those are the 3 big things that we're talking about in this class. So we're already moved on here to the 3rd big topic, right, of talking about central banking. You cannot understand how banks work, and you can't understand how financial markets work unless you understand central banking, right? Central banks are just a key part of understanding how financial systems work. And so chapter 13, I would say, really today and on Monday and on Tuesday and even into Wednesday, we're going to be spending a fair amount of time, or really the Thursday, sorry, we'll be spending a fair amount of time talking about the details of central banks, right? And so chapter 13, as I think you saw, is not a technical chapter, is really more kind of definitions and giving you a little bit of context and a little bit of history about central banks. There's probably no government entity that is as misunderstood or poorly understood as central banks. For most people, a central bank is just a black hole, right? People have heard of the Fed. They probably know the Fed is important. But in terms of understanding exactly what the Fed does, I would say the average American is almost completely ignorant about what the Fed does, which is kind of crazy because central banks play a very important role in managing our financial system, right? They play a key role in regulating the supply of money and interest rates and borrowing and lending and income and inflation and bonds and stock prices, right? So really, in many ways, central banks are crucially important. And one of the things that we see here in the US is the Fed in many ways is becoming more important over time. First, because financial systems are becoming more important, but second, because of our screwed up politics. So the fact that the president and the Congress can't always seem to get their act together really puts more pressure on the Fed to do things, right? Because the Fed, as we're going to talk about, to some extent operates outside of the regular political process, right? It has more independence to do the right thing without politics. And so, in a strange way, political dysfunction has really given the Fed more power, right? Because really, more and more we rely on the Fed to provide basic stabilization policy, right? I'm not so sure that in the long run is the best for the Fed, for reasons we're going to talk about, for reasons you read about, right? But that's the way that our system has evolved. So let's talk about some origins here and some history. always kind of like to get into the history of this because I think it gives you a little bit better context for where we've been and where we're going. So central banks have always been seen as more trustworthy guardians of a country's money supply than monarchs, right? So really, in many ways, central banking began with the Bank of England, right, which is the world's kind of first central bank. And really, the Bank of England began because the British people were a little afraid to put all of the gold in the hand of the monarch, right? And so central banks really became a way of giving some independent control, right, over the money supply. And so how a central banks really began is they began to serve this lender that goldsmiths used to play, right? So back in the ancient times, we had goldsmiths where people would deposit their gold and they would take IOUs and trade the IOUs. Well, central banks began to essentially just do that. People would deposit their gold, right? And in return, the central bank would give you some script, right? Pieces of paper, currency. And the central bank eventually began to serve official functions as essentially the bank of the government, right? And so, basically evolving from goldsmiths up to this kind of bank of the government role has been the role of central banks, right? Countries that were able to establish powerful central banks were also able to exert control over their money supply. And by exerting control over their money supply, we're able to create financial stability that allowed for financial development, right? And so one of the keys to the British Empire was the fact that the British had this very strong financial system. And one of the reasons they had a very strong financial system is because they had the Bank of England, right? That essentially allowed them to have stable currency, the pound to be kind of the international currency, and that gave them a lot of ability to finance an empire, right? And so, I think in history, right, when you took high school history, there's a lot of emphasis about, well, the British shipping empire, right, and British ships and all this kind of stuff. But really, the financial empire was just as important, if not more important, because you wouldn't have had a shipping empire if you didn't have a financial empire. Right? The ways to raise money to build all those ships was crucial. So, well, in many ways, the Bank of England was really a model for modern central banking. One of the interesting things from the United States perspective is many of our founding fathers did not want something like the Bank of England, right? So many of our founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, viewed the Bank of England as a tool of big industrial interests, right? And so they didn't trust, right, basically big government. And they really saw the Bank of England as big government. They thought the Bank of England didn't work in the interest of the common person. They really acted in the interest of a big industry. John Adams claimed that central banks damaged the morality, the tranquility, and the wealth of countries, right? And of course, Alexander Hamilton, who's kind of on the other side of this argument, argued that central banks were the happiest engines of growth that were ever invented, right? And so you saw this conflict, right? You saw this conflict where, some of our founding fathers saw the value in having a central bank, but others didn't. And so this conflict fought itself out in the early history of the United States. The first Bank of the United States, right, which was created. Let me back up here. If you look in the Constitution, there's nothing about the Federal Reserve or the central bank, right? This was essentially an issue that the founding fathers punted on, right? They said, well, we'll let the president and Congress, figure this out in the future. And so the first Bank of the United States, which is really the first central bank, was created on an act of Congress. Its charter lasted for about 5 years, and then it kind of fell apart once again because of politics. The War of 1812 came along. The U.S. did not perform so great in the War of 1812, in part because it had a real difficulty in financing the war. And so that's where the Second Bank of the United States came in. And then the Second Bank of the United States lasted until Andrew Jackson put the kibosh on it. And so we talked about this when was it? Earlier in the week. But for most of US history, we've had no central bank. Well, most, I don't know if I should say most. We've had no central bank. We've just had this, bizarre kind of situation where we had no unified currency. So you had literally banknotes, IOUs issued by banks. And these were different in different states, different from different banks. There was no kind of federal guarantee. We had no lender of last resort, LOLR. That would be my abbreviation. LOLR, no lender of last resort. You had individuals who tried to serve as lender of last resort. For instance, JP Morgan, the banker, not the bank, right? But the original banker, JP Morgan, in many ways served as a lender of last resort for the US financial system. But even JP Morgan was not rich enough to really be a lender of last resort. And so we had regular banking crises. That was a regular aspect of life in the US. Between 1870, just to give you an idea, between 1870 and 1907, so a 37-year period, there were 21 banking crises in the US of varying severity. Including in 1907, there was a crisis in which 1/3 of all banks were forced to close, at least temporarily, in the United States. So listen, this is not a sustainable system, right? It's not a sustainable system. Why were there so many banking crises? Well, we had no deposit insurance, we had no lender of last resort, but also remember we had no national banking. So all we had was a bunch of very small, undiversified banks. Right? It's just a recipe for disaster, right? Without any lender of last resort, without any safety net, these banks were undiversified, and even a small shock could mean that the bank could go out of business. And if one bank went out of business, then that led to panic, and people would withdraw their money from other banks. And this is just too common an occurrence. And so basically, this all culminated in the Federal Reserve Act. Of 1913. Okay. So here was the compromise. There was still a lot of skepticism about having a central bank, right? That's still a lot of skepticism. And so the idea was, well, let's not have one central bank. Let's have 12 regional central banks. So let me show you the map here. Okay, from a modern perspective, where these regional banks are doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. Okay. So this really reflects the United States as it existed in 1913, more so than it exists today. So we have 12 regional banks. Notice we only have one regional bank west of Dallas, right? So San Francisco really does this huge area, right? This bank is actually the Bank of Kansas City, right? So there's two in Missouri, but there's only one west of Dallas, right? Doesn't make a great deal of sense. Why are there two in Missouri? Because the Missouri senators were swing votes. And so they said, oh, can we get your vote if we put one in Kansas City and St. Louis? Sure, okay. So, you know, how these things are laid out doesn't make really a great deal of sense. As we're going to talk about, the role of these regional banks has changed over time, but they still exist, right? They still exist. Which ones are the most important? Well, the New York is by far and away the most important, in part because that's kind of the center of the financial system, right? The center of the financial world in many extent, many shapes and forms. The Chicago Fed is also very important, once again, because, you know, I think in part tradition, in part because there's, you know, the Midwest has a fairly well-developed financial system. We are part of the Chicago district. And then the other one that's particularly important is San Francisco, in part because it has such a huge area, right? And has all of California, which obviously gives it a lot of power. So the idea here was, just to back up, if we're worried about one central bank having too much power, let's create 12 central banks. And that will limit their power and kind of decentralize power. And that will be a good thing, right? That was the thinking of the original Federal Reserve system. Okay. Let's think about the functions of these regional banks. Right? What kind of things do these banks still do today? They do a lot of things that we just simply take for granted. Things like clear interbank payments. In the old days, if you, let's say, you lived in New York and somebody wrote you a check from a California bank, what would you have to do? You would actually physically have to send that check from New York to California. The bank would have to approve it and then either wire or physically send the money all the way back across the country, right? It was a very, very costly, time-consuming system. Now, how do bank payments get cleared? Through the Fed, right? So, you know, if you're in New York and somebody writes you a check on a California bank, you take that check to your New York bank. What does the New York bank do? It sends it to the New York Fed. The Fed says, I'm going to take money out of the California bank's account. I'll put it in the New York Fed's bank account. That's it, right? Now all of this takes place, right, almost instantly. It's these regional banks that kind of take care of the currency. You'll notice, you know, that on every piece of currency, you actually see which Federal Reserve bank it came from. And so, you know, one of the functions that the Federal Reserve does is they basically, as money comes through the Fed, they take old bills out of circulation and put new bills in circulation, right? We'll talk a little bit more about this later. They evaluate things like mergers, right? So if banks are going to merge, the Federal Reserve is a regulator, right? So they do a lot of bank regulation. So, you know, a bank like Hills Bank can expect to see auditors from the Federal Reserve every once in a while, right? And come and check out what they're doing. They make discount loans. These are loans to banks. Why are they called discount loans? Well, they're actually called discount loans because traditionally the Fed requires you to put up T-bills as collateral. And what's a T-bill? It's a discount bond. So that's why these are called discount loans. It doesn't really, in some sense, doesn't make much sense. But these are loans in which the Fed, as I said, usually asks you to put up some collateral like a T-bill or something. They collect local data, right? These regional banks have many, many economists working in them, thank God, right? It helps drive up wages in the economics profession, right? I think there's something in the Federal Reserve System as a whole, there's something like 5,000 economists that work for the Federal Reserve System, right? So a lot of research goes on here. And then they play a limited role in monetary policy, as we'll talk about here in a minute. Okay. Of these 12 banks, which one is the most important? The New York Fed. Right? Because of its role in regulating. Because the biggest banks are located in New York, it plays the biggest role in regulation. It's where the open market operations take place. They run the open market operations. So they basically run the logistics of monetary policy. And as we're going to talk about, it's the only regional bank that plays a permanent role in monetary policy. Okay, how did this work out? The original Fed? Pretty badly. Pretty badly. To be honest with you, this was not a particularly effective system. In part because it was too decentralized. It was too decentralized. And so you had 12 regional banks. There was really not a very strong coordination mechanism. The other problem was, particularly back in the early 1900s, economics was a relatively new discipline, right? So a lot of these banks, their understanding of monetary policy was, to put it politely, a little thin. And so some of these banks really made some strange decisions, right? Without a lot of expertise. So you had certain Federal Reserve banks like the New York Fed that always seemed to, kind of have some grasp of what's going on. But, when it came to something like the Kansas City Fed, it's not really clear that they had any view of what the big picture should be for monetary policy. And so where this really came to a head was during the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, the behavior of the Fed was pretty abominable, right? And we can maybe get into this a little bit later next week, we will. But during the Great Depression, what did the Federal Reserve do? They acted to raise interest rates. Huh? We know that's not right? But this is their thinking. We'll kind of explain their thinking, but their thinking was we should raise interest rates, and if banks are in trouble, that probably means that they're risky, so we should not lend to them, right? So the Fed did not serve as an effective lender of last resort. It did not serve very well in maintaining liquidity. It didn't serve its role in stabilizing policy. And so after, or really kind of still in the middle of the Great Depression, there's a realization that we needed a new Fed that was kind of much more, kind of centralized with a little bit more actual executive power in it. And so this was the Federal Reserve Act of 1932. So the Federal Reserve Act of 1932 created a new Federal Reserve in many ways. It kept the old one, it kept the regional banks, but it created a board of governors that kind of sat on top of these regional banks. So 7 members with 14-year terms. One of them is nominated as a chairperson who serves a 4-year term. And instead of having their location spread out across the country, their location is now centralized in Washington, D.C., which makes sense. Does this setup look somewhat familiar? Yeah, what's this modeled after? Supreme Court. In fact, if you've been to Washington, the Board of Governors is right across the street from the Supreme Court, right? And so really, this is very much set up like the Supreme Court, right? Where we have regional, right? Appellate courts, right? But then we have a Supreme Court on top of it. And in the Supreme Court, they have lifetime terms. Here, it's not lifetime, but it's very long, right? And the idea here is try to isolate it from politics. Put them on for a long period of time, let them do their job, make sure they don't feel political pressure. One of them is nominated as chair, right? In the Supreme Court, you are, essentially the head judge, right? That is, once again, kind of a lifetime appointment. Here, it's not a lifetime appointment, but it's for a fairly long period of time, right? And so the idea, once again, is to kind of put a lot of executive power. And so the Board of Governors is where most of the power resides now in the Federal Reserve. So it's the Board of Governors who are the majority when making monetary policy. We'll explain this in a second. They set the required reserve ratio on banks. These are the people who do the direct advising to the President and Congress. And it's these Board of Governors that are the systematic regulators of the entire financial system. Okay, there's one other group that we have to be familiar with. I mentioned here that it's the majority when making monetary policy. Who actually makes monetary policy? Well, monetary policy itself is determined by the Federal Open Market Committee. So this is a committee of people within the Federal Reserve. Who's in it? The 7 governors, the New York Fed president, and 4 of the 11 other presidents on a rotating basis. So this is the group that actually sets monetary policy. So this committee meets every 6 weeks in the District of Columbia. At the Federal Reserve Bank of DC, there's this huge conference room. There's this huge table, kind of an amazingly big table. And even if you're not currently serving on the committee, the regional presidents meet. They bring their pet economists. So there's like 70 people sitting around this huge table. And what they do is they talk about what monetary policy is going to be. Unlike most of the other things that happen in Washington, D.C., the Fed is still a pretty consensus-orientated place, right? The culture of the place still is towards consensus. So that doesn't mean that everybody agrees, but there's a fair amount of consensus, right? There's usually a lot of work towards consensus, right? And so this is one of the things that's interesting about the Fed, is that if you look at the formal structure of the Fed, it's still fairly decentralized power. Formally, the chair doesn't have a lot of formal power. And yes, these 7 governors have formal power, but it's not dramatically greater than the regional presidents. Informal, the formal structure. But the actual structure is much more centralized. More so than in its formal structure, the chairperson has a lot of power. In part because they're the person on television, right? So some of this is just kind of the way that things have evolved over time. That the person on television gets a lot of power. And I think it's also as I said, going back to consensus. Consensus means that there's really a lot of deference to what the majority wants, right? And very much times a lot of consensus to what the chairperson wants. And luckily, the U.S. has been very, very fortunate to have, I would say, in general, very, very effective people on the Board of Governors and very, very effective chairs, okay? So Jerome Powell right now is chairman of the Fed. So Jerome Powell was actually appointed by Trump. So the previous chair of the Fed, I'm forgetting her name now. Gosh, I'm having a senior moment. But anyway, she was appointed by Obama. She only served a 4-year term. Trump chose not to reappoint her. She was seen by everybody as competent. I think there were a lot of people that were worried about what Trump's appointment would be. But Powell was actually a consensus appointment. He's somebody that was held in very high regards by people on both sides of the aisle. And it's hard to argue that he has not been an effective chairman of the Federal Reserve, right? And so, we've been lucky that in general, competent people have been appointed to the Fed. This is not always the case in government, right? Increasingly, this is not the case, right? and we'll kind of come back to this, is that to some extent, the Fed's been able to kind of protect this political independence and kind of focus on confidence as opposed to politics. But you kind of wonder in this age where politics become more and more important, right? I mean, you know, nowadays we even have political appointees to the Centers for Disease Control, right? You kind of wonder how long this will last. Let's talk about what exactly do we mean by a central bank? All right, what exactly is central banking? Well, a central bank, probably the easiest way to think about a central bank is it is a bank for banks. And it's a bank for the government. It's a bank for banks. Okay. Okay. So what does this mean? Well, this really means that there's kind of three fundamental responsibilities that central banks hold. First off, I just said, the central bank serves as a bank for banks. They hold required reserves for banks. They clear interbank payments. They make discount loans. If a bank needs to borrow, banks can borrow from other banks, but they can also borrow from the Fed. So if banks need some liquidity, right, they can go to the Fed. And the Fed provides liquidity in many ways, in part by clearing interbank payments, right? I mean, this is huge for banks in terms of providing liquidity. Banks need to have payments moving, right? If there's some sort of block in the system, their liquidity could dry up. And so really, the Fed serves as a bank for banks so that banks can serve as a bank for people, right? That is in many ways a lot of what the Fed does. As I said here, the Fed is also the bank for the government. Okay? It works closely with the US Treasury. So let me just say a little bit about this, because I think for some of us, maybe I've always got the impression that many of us listen or never really kind of taught in high school civics how exactly the US government works. So the US Treasury is something different from the Fed, right? It's the Treasury that's responsible for collecting taxes and paying the government's bills, right? That's not the job of the Fed. So it's the US Treasury that manages fiscal policy, right? That collects taxes, that pays the government's bills. How exactly does the Treasury manage its payments? Well, it does that through the Fed. So if you get a tax refund, you'll see that it comes from the US Treasury's account, but what's the bank that issues the check? The Federal Reserve, right? So the Federal Reserve is the bank of the US Treasury, right? It's the Treasury that's the client, and it's the Federal Reserve that provides the banking services, okay? So why this is so important, to be clear, is that the Fed does not control fiscal policy, right? The Fed doesn't set government spending. It doesn't collect taxes, right? That is a separate branch of government. That's the Treasury. And the Treasury gets its working orders from the president and from Congress, right? The Fed is, as we're going to talk about, somewhat independent from that, right? The Fed is just the bank, right? They just kind of manage the payments. And so don't be confused into thinking that somehow the Fed controls fiscal policy, because they don't, right? That's really the responsibility of the president and Congress. What the Fed does control is monetary policy. It's 3 responsibilities. There's more than that. 5. I have these broken up in a different way. Bank regulation. So we talked about the Frank-Dodd Act. That makes the Fed the primary regulator of the US financial system. Okay. So they set required reserve ratio, bank loan standards. They can set capital requirements. The Fed has the power to adjust capital requirements, reporting standards. So this is an area where the Fed has gotten a lot more powerful. The Fed, previous to Dodd-Frank, the Fed did do bank regulation, but more on a case-by-case, bank-by-bank level. Now the Fed is really the primary regulator, and they can regulate a whole bunch of things that they couldn't before. For instance, capital requirements. The Fed did not set capital requirements on banks before Dodd-Frank. Now the Fed has more power to do that, right? So this is giving the Fed a lot more power. Related to this, the Fed is a lender of last resort. They can make loans to banks. However, we need to be clear about this. Does the Fed have to give you a loan? No. In fact, really, the law is the law, and this law has actually been clarified under Dodd-Frank. It's not the job of the Federal Reserve to lend to banks that are insolvent. And by that meaning, their assets are less than their liabilities. It's only their job to lend to banks that are illiquid. So during the 2008 financial crisis, Lehman Brothers failed. And many people have criticized the Fed for not doing more to try to save Lehman. But, and I mean, I think it's not an invalid criticism, right? I think you can make the criticism, well, the Fed, even if they had to bend the law, they should have done something. I think there's a point to that. But within the Fed, it was very clear. They looked at Lehman's books and they said, Lehman is fundamentally insolvent. We can't by law lend them any money, right? And so that was really the decision that was made at the Fed. Whether that was the right or the wrong decision, I don't know. But by the letter of the law, it was the right decision. It was the only decision that they could make by the letter of the law. So this is one of the things, if you go to the Fed and you ask for a loan, this is going to be the first question the Fed's got to decide. Are you just having a temporary liquidity problem, or is something much more fundamental going on? If you have a liquidity problem, we'll lend you money. If you don't, then what happens? You don't get any money. If you don't get any money, you shut down. And what happens when you shut down? Well, this is the role of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, right? Basically, the job of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is to liquidate insolvent banks. So the FDIC comes in, they pay off all depositors, and they sell all the assets. And what happens to the difference? They eat it. They eat the difference, okay? Where does the FDIC get its money? Well, most of the money in the FDIC comes from banks themselves, right? So banks have to pay premiums. So the FDIC, in some sense, is like an insurance company. Banks pay premiums, and those premiums create a fund that the FDIC uses to liquidate banks, right? But ultimately, that fund is not huge. And so who's ultimately on the hook? Taxpayers, right? I mean, if that fund would go to zero, then it would be taxpayers would have to pay it out. And this has happened. Back in the 1980s, the savings and loan crisis, which we've talked about briefly a couple of times. That was a big enough crisis that basically the FDIC said, we don't have enough money for it. And so taxpayers had to pay for it, right? Taxpayers had to pay for it. So, but that's not the role of the Fed, once again. The Fed is only to correct for illiquidity. It's not to bail out failing banks. But you can imagine, in the middle of a crisis, how do you tell the difference between these two things? It's not that easy, right? It's not that easy. And yeah, I mean, it's a tough job. And then the final thing, and this is really going to be, I think, what we focus on Monday and Tuesday, is set monetary policy. Particularly that Federal Open Market Committee. So as I said, this is really the mechanics of this are going to be what we talk about beginning of next week, right? So we'll kind of come back to this question. We'll come back to number 5 and talk about this in more detail, because obviously there's a lot to be said here. Okay, you had a couple of readings that both of them in some way, shape, or form were talking about the independence of the Federal Reserve. Okay, and so let's spend a little bit of time talking about, is the Fed independent? How independent? Should it be independent? Okay. So Mishkin, in your book, I think makes an important distinction here. When you think about the independence of a central bank, there's really 2 types of independence. One is, we call it instrument independence. How do you go about running the mechanics of monetary policy? Right? And by mechanics, basically the operations. Do you kind of run your operations as you see fit? And then the other one is goal independence. Do you have control over the goals you're trying to achieve? Okay. So, is the Fed independent? Is it instrument independent, and is it goal independent? Yeah, I think the main answer is yes, right? Pretty much. I will go as far enough to say very independent. In terms of it has a lot of flexibility in both of these things, impacting the goals and the instruments, what it's trying to achieve and how it tries to achieve that. What gives them this independence? What is it in our structure that gives them independence from the other parts of government? Do they have to go for elections every couple of years? No, they have 14-year terms. They're not elected. How do you get to be on the Board of Governors? Once again, it's like being in the Supreme Court. You get nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Okay, so it's very much like being on the Supreme Court. And so you don't have to be a politician to be on there once you get nominated. And if you get approved, then, there you go. You have a 14-year term. Another reason why the Fed is very independent, this one is not very obvious. Right? I'll write it down. It is obvious once you read it. It's probably not obvious till you don't think about it. The Fed doesn't have to go to Congress every year for a budget. So in many ways, the Fed is the only part of government that doesn't have to go through the traditional congressional budget approval process. Why? Where does the Fed get its money? It makes it up, right? The Fed, through conducting open market operations, makes a lot of money. So how do they pay their bills? Basically, from that money, they pay their bills, and then they return the rest to the Treasury. Okay? But that gives them a lot of independence because Congress has a hard time telling the Fed, you have to do this or you have to do that. If you don't, I'm going to cut your money, your budget. That's usually how Congress threatens other avenues of government, right? So, if the Center for Disease Control doesn't do something that the Congress likes, they'll cut their budget. Well, you can't do that to the Fed. Right? You really can't do that to the Fed, and that gives them a lot of independence. This is something that some members of Congress have been talking about doing away with. There's periodically a lot of talk about basically auditing the Fed. This tends to be in conservative circles, auditing the Fed. We should know what the Fed does. We should know how the Fed spends its money. The Fed should give us more information. Realistically, the Fed does already provide almost all of that information. Auditing the Fed is much more about trying to make sure that the Fed is more accountable to Congress, right? And you might say, well, that sounds like a good thing, right? But, right, the cynic in me says, well, why does Congress want the Fed to be more accountable to them? so they can control them, right? So they can tell the Fed more what to do and what not to do. And as we're going to see, that would make the Fed more vulnerable to political pressure. And so, you know, a lot of things about this auditing the Fed sounds very common sense until you kind of think about it a little bit more, right? And then you see that it may not be such a great idea. The other reason why the Fed has a lot of independence is because the goals are set for the Fed, but the goals are very loose. Basically, the goals are set for the Fed in the Employment Act of 1946. Where the Fed is essentially charged with maintaining full employment and price stability. The Fed's charged with maintaining full employment and price stability. The Fed refers to this as the dual mandate. And we'll talk about the dual mandate a lot next week. Get used to this phrase, right? But the dual mandate is full employment and price stability. But when you think about this, yes, this is the goal the Fed's supposed to achieve. But is this a very rigorous or tightly defined goal? It's pretty loose, right? I mean, what exactly does price stability mean? What exactly does full employment mean? It's not specifically laid out. And so, once again, the Fed has a lot of leeway. Here in interpreting this as they need to. So yes, the Fed is quite independent. It is unusual. There is no doubt about it. The Fed is different from really any other form of government or any other part of our government in the amount of independence it has. I mean, you can argue that the Fed in its own way is even more independent than the judiciary, right, from Congress to the president, in a strange way, right, in a strange way. However, is it completely independent? What are the limits on its independence? Can the Fed just do whatever they want? What's the ultimate limit on their independence? Who created the Fed? Congress and the president. Who could get rid of the Fed? Congress and the president, right? The Fed is not in the Constitution. The Fed is not in the Constitution. So just like the first Bank of the United States was disbanded, the second Bank of the United States was disbanded, an act of Congress could always change this. And so if the Fed ever did something that sufficiently pissed off Congress and the president, yeah, you know, the rules of their existence could change, right? There's another limit on independence, and that is the nomination process. The nomination process. Will it become more political? Okay, so as I said, in the past, presidents have tended not to make politics a big part of these nominations, right? They've tended to, quite honestly, generally pick pretty competent people and not people that were closely associated with one party or another. You will not be surprised to learn that this might be changing, right? So Trump has recently nominated to the Fed a person by the name of Judy Shelton, who is not an economist. She's a lawyer and basically has done a lot of writing, right? She's more of a journalist than an economist. And Judy Shelton is a crazy person. At least economists think she's a crazy person. She's had all sorts of crazy ideas, such as she would like the US to go back to the gold standard. That she thinks that the Federal Reserve has been run by a cabal. In fact, she's been associated with ideas that says the Federal Reserve is a tool of Jewish interests, right? All this horrible stuff, right? We have not had nominees like this in the past, right? We've not had nominees. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is that Judy Shelton's nomination has been hung up for months because even a lot of Republicans don't think that she's competent and prepared to be on the Federal Reserve. So I think there is a good chance that she's not going to make it. But by appointing somebody like Judy Shelton, this was like a lightning bolt to a lot of economists, right? I mean, this is what we've worried about, right? That in the future, it's not going to be so much about competence, it's going to be about politics, right? And so that's a worry, right? And somehow, some way, the Fed has largely stayed out of politics, but you really wonder if that can be possible. And I think this was really the point of that article from The Economist, right? Is that when the Fed is seen as being more and more engaged in politics, it really loses a lot of its power, right? Because one of the things that is powerful about the Fed is it's seen as being apolitical, right? That both parties seem to give the Fed a lot of leeway because I think there's this general consensus that whether I agree with it or not, the Fed's trying to do the right thing, or at least what they perceive to be the right thing. But if in the future, the Fed is seen as trying to advance a political interest, that puts them at a lot of risk and it puts the work they do at a lot of risk. How does the Fed compare to other central banks? Right, let's talk about this a little bit. Every country in the world has a central bank, right? Well, I think that's true. Maybe I should say almost every country, though I can't think of an exception, right? Usually these central banks are, pretty obvious, right? In Canada, it's the Bank of Canada. In Japan, it's the Bank of Japan. In England, it's the Bank of England. In China, it's not the Bank of China, it's the People's Bank of China, right? Which that's also often a source of confusion, right? The Bank of China, there is a Bank of China that is not the central bank, but the People's Bank of China is the central bank. All of these have much different structures. Some of them are more independent, some of them are less independent, right? So, one of the interesting things is how different each of these central banks are. And there's a big difference in many of these central banks with their formal structure and their informal structure, right? For some central banks, their formal structure is very independent, but informally, they're not independent, right? Meaning the president and the legislature play a big role in managing what's happened. So it differs a lot. But I think that the other central bank that we should be most familiar with is the European Central Bank. Well, yeah, I mean, there's really two other central banks that we'll talk about a fair amount in this class. One is the People's Bank of China, and we'll do that more when we talk about the Chinese financial system at the end of class. But then the European Central Bank, right, the ECB. So the ECB was created by the European Monetary Union. In 1999. Okay, so the European Monetary Union. We have many countries in the European Monetary Union. We want each of these countries to feel included in the European Monetary Union. Each country has to have some input, but we also realize that there's a lot of good that comes from having centralized power. So we have this trade-off between decentralization and centralization. Is there another central bank that we can look to as a model for how to do this? The Fed, right? And so really the European Central Bank is modeled after the Fed. Should I say it's a branch bank or a so every country has a branch of the European Central Bank in it. And then there's the ECB governors, European Central Bank governors. It's composed of representatives from each country. And of this, one is nominated as chair. And this is where the centralized power is. So the European ECB governors are very much like the Board of Governors for the Fed. Very much like the Board of Governors. How independent is the European Central Bank? Well, in some ways, it's more independent than the Fed, but in other ways, it's less independent, right? In terms of goal independence, the ECB actually has very little goal independence. Unlike the Fed that has a lot of leeway to determine what it wants, the European Central Bank has a single goal, inflation of 2%. Right? We're going to call this an inflation target. Or an inflation rule. And so the the ECB has very little very little goal independence. And this is one of the things that got it in trouble during the European debt crisis, right? Is that the ECB really had very little flexibility to try to respond because, well, they had one thing to do, right? They're really charged with one thing to do. How about instrument independence? Here the ECB has a lot, right? So the ECB has a lot of ability to kind of change how they go about their job, but not a lot of ability in terms of what they decide to do. And so we're going to come back and talk about the advantages of having inflation targets versus not. But this is a big trade-off, right? The fans of inflation targets say, listen, the nice thing about an inflation target is you have a clear goal, and when you have a clear goal, you're more likely to achieve it, as opposed to having multiple goals that you're always trying to balance, like you're juggling. And of course, what happens if you screw up? Everything comes crashing down, right? It's a lot easier to juggle one ball and never drop it than to juggle 5 balls and never drop it. On the flip side, you know, what's the one ball, right? I mean, in complex economies, it's hard to think about just thinking about one thing, right? And so we'll come back and talk about this. Should central banks be independent? Okay, should central banks be independent? Well, let's first talk about the arguments no. Right? You will not be surprised that I don't find these to be particularly appealing, right, or persuasive. I shouldn't say that they're not persuasive. I don't feel that these, you know, the no's beat the yeses. But I mean, there are some reasonable reasons to be against central bank independence. One of them is that many people say that this is just simply undemocratic. Right? How is it that a bunch of people who've never been in an election have so much power? That's a good question. That's a good question, right? So many people don't like this because there's no public accountability to the Fed. Of course, what's the response to this? Are we a democracy? No, we're a republic, right? There's a lot of things about our system that are not particularly democratic. Right? And so, you know, the fact that this is undemocratic, yes, but so are a lot of things in our system, right? So are a lot of things in our system. Many people argue are the Fed's objectives your objectives? All right, excellent question. Who works on the Fed? What can we say about the typical person who works at the Fed? They're economists or they're from the banking industry, financial industry. They tend to be older. They tend to be male. They tend to be white. Right? They tend to be rich. Okay? And so maybe you can see what's happening, you know, the potential problem here. They might think they're doing what's in the best public interest, but their perception of the public interest is largely reflective of their privilege, right? So the classic complaint that many people have is, should the Fed put more pressure on low inflation or low unemployment? And traditionally, I think it's fair to say, of these two, which one does the Fed worry about more? The Fed worries about inflation, in part because of their perspective as economists and as people in finance. But other people say, no, the Fed should be worried a lot more about unemployment, right? Even if it drives up inflation. Natalie, can you please stop with the watch? So, you know, I think this is a legitimate criticism, right? This is a legitimate criticism, particularly because these people on the Fed are not elected, right? So these two things kind of relate to each other. They're not elected. They tend to have this very, you know, kind of privileged existence. And as a result, they may not think about the things the same way that you want to. Of course, one argument for the Federal Reserve being independent is we want experts, we want expertise, right? But one of the things we know is that expertise does not guarantee success. Right? It doesn't guarantee success. It doesn't make sure that it doesn't guarantee that you're not going to make mistakes. So quite honestly, we have a Supreme Court nominee and debate going on right now. Really, everything about the Fed could also be said about the Supreme Court, right? Quite honestly. Many people, one of the reasons why the Supreme Court is so contentious is because it's undemocratic, right? You know, once you get somebody on the Supreme Court, they stay there for the rest of your life, right? That's not really particularly democratic. The fact that the Supreme Court is not democratic actually in many ways makes it more important in our political system. And same thing for the Fed. Are the Supreme Court's objectives yours, right? That's always an excellent question. I believe that this Barrett, what's her name? I can't remember. She's, if appointed, she would be the only person on the Supreme Court that didn't go to law school in an Ivy League institution, right? She went to that piece of crap school, Notre Dame, right? And so we've got a lot of people that are elitist. Well, I should say not elitist, but definitely have elite backgrounds, right? And of course, they all have the same training. They're lawyers, right? And they're lawyers who served as judges. Many people complain that the Supreme Court shouldn't just all be judges, that maybe it should be politicians or it should have people that have a broader background, right? I think you probably need to have a degree in law, right? But not everybody in law goes on to be a judge, right? There's other backgrounds in law that might prepare you for being in the Supreme Court better than just being a judge. So whatever you think about those arguments, they're really, in many ways, the same arguments about the Fed, right? They're really the same arguments about the Fed. So given all that, why do economists continue to believe that independent central banks are a good thing? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First, there is an inflationary bias in monetary policy. It's always easier to raise the money supply and raise inflation than it is to cut the money supply and cut inflation. And so what happens if we just leave this to politicians? What will politicians tend to pick? More and more inflation, right? And if you don't believe that, just listen to some of the things that the Fed said, or I'm sorry, that President Trump said. Sorry for being so political today, but some of the things that President Trump said after he appointed Jerome Powell, right? He appointed Jerome Powell to be the chairman, and almost immediately as he got there, Trump started complaining about his job he's doing. It's like he needs lower interest rates, lower interest rates, lower interest rates, lower interest rates, right? Because Trump obviously wants a faster growing economy. And he's thinking about getting reelected, as most politicians do. On this, the only thing that separates Trump from most politicians is he's actually more honest in many ways, right? Like Trump actually comes out and literally says what he wants. You know, I think most presidents have wanted the Fed to cut interest rates, and if it means raise inflation, fine. That's the next person's problem, right? But that, of course, is not the job of the Federal Reserve. And it becomes a lot easier for the Federal Reserve to focus on the long term. and not just the short term, not just the next election. I mean, this is really why, as I said at the beginning of class, why central banks were formed in the first place. The idea that we didn't really want the monarchs to be in charge of the financial system and money. It's probably better to take it out of the hands of the monarchs and put it in the hands of bankers, right, who are going to be more conservative with it. And, you know, that the same logic holds, right? Because there is the danger of political business cycles. Which was mentioned in your article, right? The goal of monetary policy can become not keeping inflation low or the economy strong, but winning an election. All right. And so, you know, there is always a danger of this, right? There is always a danger of this. In the Watergate tapes, right? You're familiar with that, hopefully. Richard Nixon, right? That for whatever bizarre reason recorded a lot of his Oval Office conversations. And of course, those Watergate tapes got him in trouble because he recorded a lot of illegal activity that went on there. But he also recorded a lot of other kind of questionable behavior, including right before the 1972 election, basically calling up the Federal Reserve Chairman and screaming at him, cussing him out, saying, "You need to get me elected. I appointed you. You need to get me elected." And there's some evidence that that worked, that the Fed actually cut interest rates and tried to stimulate the economy when there wasn't really a good argument for it, right before the 1972 election. And so that's dangerous, right? That's dangerous. There's not just the pressure to win elections. Oftentimes, there's the pressure to pay the bills. In other words, fiscal dominance takes place in which paying the bills becomes the big goal of monetary policy. So what happens if central banks get tied too closely to just paying the bills? Well, to pay the bills, what are you going to have to do? Print up money. And what's the long-term consequence of that? Inflation or hyperinflation, right? As we talked about yesterday, right? Hyperinflations are almost always the consequence of debt crises, right? Fiscal dominance, needing money to pay the bills. And when you print up too much money, you're going to get hyperinflation. Many people said we need central bank independence because we just can't trust politicians to do this. It's too complicated for them. This sounds demeaning, and it probably is. That said, it is interesting when the chairman of the Fed goes to Congress and has to testify before Congress, and you hear some of the questions that he gets asked, and you realize that most of the people in Congress could not come close to passing a principles of macro exam, right? I mean, the fundamental misunderstanding about how most members of Congress view the Fed and monetary policy. I mean, when I said that for the public, monetary policy is a black box, that also applies to most members of Congress, right? I'm not really sure they understand. So yes, this is the meaning, right? To say that it's too complex for most people. But there might be an element of truth to this, right? And it's not that people can't understand this. I'm not saying that it's too complex for people to understand. I think a lot of people care not to understand, right? A lot of people care not to understand. Finally, there is a good argument that we should never let monetary policy be determined by a simple majority, because that's likely to lead to very bad monetary policy. Why? Because the number of borrowers is always greater than the number of lenders. So let's say that we just did a simple majority vote. And here's the question. Inflation should go up, yes or no? Well, if everybody votes on their self-interest, what are they going to vote for? Borrowers would vote for high inflation, and lenders would vote for low inflation. So if it's just a simple majority vote, high inflation is always going to win. And what do we get? Higher and higher inflation until we have a ruined financial system, which isn't good for anybody. And so, what I'm really saying here, this is the argument, as you probably remember from your civics class, for checks and balances, right? The tyranny of the majority is the reason why we're not, one of the big reasons why we're not a democracy. Because our founding fathers worried that if we put everything up to majority vote, that the minority would get screwed all the time. And so that's why we have checks and balances. And the same holds for monetary policy, right? It's good not to have the majority interest always be the ruling part of monetary policy. So you can kind of think about this going back to that question of, is the Fed's objectives yours? Yeah, the Fed is a bunch of bankers, but maybe that's a good thing, because a bunch of bankers will, think about the long term and, maybe not think only about what's in the public, what's in the majority of the public interest. So economists tend to be favored, fans of independent monetary policy, and you could pick that up in the economist articles, right? And those economist articles were simply projecting a view that the independence of monetary banks is something that's important and should be protected, right? And so one of the things that we've seen across the globe is, you look at the data, in general, countries that have more independent central banks have better economic performance. Countries that have less independent central banks have worse economic performance. And by that I mean lower economic growth, lower inflation, weaker financial systems, less developed bond markets, less developed stock markets, shakier banks, right? And so there's just a lot of, I think there's a very strong amount of economic evidence that having independent central banks is a very, very important thing. But, that doesn't mean that always rests comfortably in a democracy, right? And so, yeah, you have to recognize that this is to some extent an undemocratic system, right? It's an undemocratic system, as is our entire sorts of government. I guess, the question for the future always is this the undemocratic thing in our system that's worse than other undemocratic things in our system, right? And, here I'm standing on my soapbox, but I would say no. There's a lot bigger undemocratic things in our system that create problems a lot more serious than this problem in the Federal Reserve. But anyway, you can kind of think about that for yourself. Okay, so I think we're going to stop right there. Okay, it's a good day's work. Have a good afternoon. Remember, no class this afternoon. Have a good weekend. If questions come up, feel free to ask about them. But if I don't hear from you this weekend, we'll talk on Monday.